So the pop-up exhibition is based on the book Aesthetics and Counter-Aesthetics of International Justice, which is a project that brought together academics and artists to think about the dominant way in which we look at and perceive international justice.
Yeah, and in a sense, one of the reasons that we chose to do an exhibition specifically was in response to an exhibition which happened itself at the International Criminal Court. And one of the things that we saw at that exhibition, and that prompted us to think about this, was that exhibition portrayed people in particular ways, it put out particular images, stereotypes, and we wanted to reflect on that, both in the book and then in our kind of closing the circle way, our own exhibition here today.
So one of the things that really jumped out to us, or seemed very evident from the International Criminal Court's Justice Matters exhibition, was the way in which there was a reproduction of a particular stereotype of victims and perpetrators, but then also the judiciary on the other side. So the victims of international crimes were often portrayed as racialized and feminized, and were presented in a way that drew attention to their suffering in a very particular way. So when we then reflected on what that means in terms of aesthetics, it seemed to us important to say that aesthetics is not just about what you see, but it's also a wider understanding of aesthetics, and particularly one that has important political implications.
Yeah, so I mean, just to briefly follow up on that, so although aesthetics is about what you see directly, we've kind of understood it to mean more broadly about how we perceive things and how we perceive the world. I used the word vibe at one point, which Christina did not like so much, but the sense of creating an atmosphere or perception of how things are, which then has a political consequence, because these questions are always political. How we understand and perceive a thing will condition how we respond to it, how we negotiate it, and how we navigate it, and therefore will have these political consequences. I feel like we should say something like, what do you mean by a dominant aesthetic?
Yeah.
So one of the things that we wanted to get at in both the book and the exhibition is that insofar as aesthetics are political, they are not simply politically neutral. And because of that, we hit upon this kind of term or concept of the dominant aesthetic. And by the dominant aesthetic, we mean two things. We firstly mean the kind of predominant mainstream, if you like, aesthetics, or the one which you see most commonly. But also crucially, linked to that being so common, we understood the dominant aesthetic as one which helped to reinforce and reproduce the status quo, which is usually structured by unequal power relations.
So I guess that leads to the question of justice, right? So what is it about the dominant way in which justice is being portrayed, and what stories are being told about justice? And often the ways in which we saw this dominant story playing out is that justice was seen as apolitical, that the law was seen as apolitical, the law was seen as coming in to save the day, and in particular, when we think about conflict, which was presented which is often presented in a way as being sort of an excess of the political, and then the law would come in a neutral fashion. And so we wanted to problematize that in this project and exhibition.
So insofar as we've said that there is a thing called this dominant aesthetic, which is both dominant in terms of like being the major aesthetic, but also dominant in terms of reinforcing and supporting the status quo, we have the idea of a counter aesthetic as something which will oppose that dominant aesthetic. And it's a counter aesthetic both in the sense that kind of aesthetically it is diverging from the norm, it does not adopt the same aesthetic practices as the dominant aesthetic. But it's also counter-aesthetic in the sense that it is also opposing the politics of that dominant aesthetic. So it's counter in this double sense, both in terms of its form, but also in a way in terms of the content or the social forces that it's representing. And we essentially, in the book and in the exhibition, think about 3 different tactics or modes of counter-aesthetics.
So, and that's also to say that the contributors in the book have not necessarily had to respond to our suggestions for counter-aesthetics, but a lot of them have in one way or another. So 3 techniques of counter-aesthetics that we propose are, first of all, rupture, which is the process of making the familiar strange or breaking with the familiar. And we were inspired there by, for example, Bertolt Brecht and the process of rupture or breaking the fourth wall. Secondly, détournement, which is a term that we take from the Situationist International, which is a process of okay. Secondly, détournement, which is a process of diversion, especially from a capitalist viewpoint. We can think there of different sort of art collectives who have used that that form, and solidarity aesthetics then as the third point, which is about forms of representation that make an intervention explicitly for the interests of the oppressed. And one of the examples that we use there in our framing of counter-aesthetics are the tricontinental posters, one of which is also the cover of the book.
Well, so I guess, in a sense, what we've given everyone, hopefully already by talking through some of our thought processes, are some of the things that we would like people to reflect on. So we'd like people to reflect, at least initially, on how they kind of understand the dominant representation of international justice to be, and then to look at the various kind of excellent pieces of artistic production that we've got around, and see how they contest and challenge those dominant ideas. And in particular, we think it might be interesting for people to try and think how these different works of art and artistic production might fit into the kind of tactics and techniques of counter-aesthetics that we have already discussed, and see if some do more than one, maybe some do none, and use that to reflect upon how it is that we can sometimes challenge those dominant aesthetic representations.
Yeah, so more specifically then, one of the things that visitors might reflect on is questions like, who are the agents of international justice? Who is considered as behind international justice? When there is injustice, then who is it that is considered to be responsible for creating justice? And just to think about in which ways that's not just textually presented through judgments and commentary, but also visually presented. And another thing that we would like visitors to reflect on is that when we think about aesthetics more generally, this is not about sort of Western dominated high art. There's a real invitation there to think about the different ways in which you can express justice and solidarity through comics, for example, through posters, through bringing these topics to people rather than having them as distanced from people. So it would be really nice to see visitors of the exhibition feel like they are participating also in an idea of international justice and perhaps pushing back against some of the more problematic aspects of the dominant aesthetics.
Oh, here's this thing where we're problematizing the glossy apolitical representation of an aesthetic.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah,
And then we're
really.
like, I now think that we actually have to include some of the outtakes. No, I do. As a kind of to make a point about like disrupting an aesthetic flow.
Yeah.
To just like have a couple of moments.